We're back on Inside USA talking to Noam Chomsky in his MIT office, lovely book-filled space. The Democrats in this election campaign have been talking a lot, maybe less so more recently, about withdrawing from Iraq. What are the chances that a new president will significantly change course on the occupation and that there might be any change for the people of Iraq as a result of the electoral moment in the United States?
Well, one of the few journalists who really covers Iraq intimately from inside is Nir Rosen, who speaks Arabic and passed for Arab, gets through the site. He's been there for 5 or 6 years, has done wonderful reporting. His conclusion, recently published, is, as he puts it, there are no solutions. He said this has been worse than the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. You can only look for the least bad solution, but the country's destroyed. And in fact, it has been catastrophic. A lot of the Democrats are now silenced because of the supposed success of the surge, which itself is interesting. Mm-hmm. It reflects the fact that there's no principled criticism of the war. So if it turns out you're gaining your goals, well, then it was okay. I mean, we don't act that way, say, when the Russians invade Chechnya. If it happens, they're doing much better than the U.S. in Iraq. And in fact, what's actually happening in Iraq is kind of ironic. I mean, it's turning into a U.S.-Iranian condominium. The Iraqi, what's called the Iraqi government, the Maliki government, is the sector of Iraqi society that is most supported by Iran. The so-called army, just another militia, is largely based on the Badr Brigade, which was trained in Iran, fought on the Iranian side during the Iran-Iraq War. It was part of the Revolutionary Guards, the hated Revolutionary Guards. It didn't intervene when Saddam was massacring Shiites with U.S. approval after the first Gulf War. That's the core of the army. And the figure who is most disliked by the Iranians is, of course, Muqtada al-Sadr, for the same reason he's disliked by the Americans. He's independent. If you read the American press, you'd think that his first name is renegade or something. It's always the renegade cleric or the radical cleric or something. That's a phrase that means he's independent. He has popular support and he's independent. He doesn't favor occupation. Well, the Iranian government doesn't like him for the same reason. So yeah, perfectly happy to see the U.S. institute government, which is receptive to their influence. And for the Iraqi people, it's a disaster. And it'll become a worse disaster once the effects of the warlordism and tribalism and sectarianism sink in more deeply.
You know, you wrote in 2004, and this is a quote from an article you wrote, about crimes displayed on the front pages for which the civilian leadership is subject to the death penalty under the War Crimes Act passed by the Republican Congress in 1996.
That's right.
So are you suggesting that Bush and Cheney should be put to death?
I'm personally opposed to the death penalty.
Okay, or that a Democratic candidate should be subject to...
Yeah, in fact, the whole invasion is a major war crime. These, incidentally, are among the topics that cannot be discussed. So there's a huge discussion of the war in Iraq, but no discussion as to whether it was the war crime of aggression. Do the Nuremberg principles apply? Actually, it's kind of interesting that the Iraqis are probably unaware of the Nuremberg principles. They support them. We don't. And that's very clear from Pentagon studies of opinion. So the Pentagon released a study of focus groups in Iraq last December, which was very upbeat. They said, contrary to what a lot of critics say, there are a lot of shared beliefs among Iraqis. So there's a hope of reconciliation. So we should go ahead. And you look down and see what were the shared beliefs. Well, the first of the shared beliefs was that the sectarian violence that is tearing the country apart is the fault of the American invasion. In other words, they accept the Nuremberg principles, which say that aggression is the supreme international crime because it includes all of the evil that follows.
Like invading a country.
Invading a country is the crime, but it includes all of the evil that follows.
And yet there's a sense in the United States and maybe even in Iraq, and we have less access to data about public opinion there that doesn't come from the Pentagon, that people are now just waiting for the clock to tick down on the Bush years and for something else to happen.
They're hoping. And I don't think that the next candidate, maybe even McCain, would be as crazed as the Bush administration has been. And people in the region understand that. It's remarkable. Bush just visited Saudi Arabia twice, once in January, once in May. Saudi Arabia is the oldest and most valued ally of the United States, not because of its wonderful democracy, but because it has the oil. Okay, in January, and the Saudi press is pretty obedient. Pretty. They don't denounce visiting dignitaries. That's, if only because of Arab politeness, let alone the kind of country it is. When Bush visited in January, the major Saudi press bitterly condemned, I think it was Rice actually they were talking about, as pursuing not diplomacy in search of peace, but madness in search of war.
You're describing, in a way, a kind of a Bush administration exceptionalism, that this is a low point for a U.S.
It is. They're extreme.
Administration that you have been criticizing for decades.
There's a pretty narrow spectrum, but it is a spectrum. And the Bush administration is way out at the extreme. In fact, so much so that from the very beginning, they were pretty harshly condemned right in the midst of the establishment. So again, say, take foreign affairs, super respectable. When Bush's national security strategy was announced in September 2002, within weeks, they had a major article harshly condemning it as what they called a new Imperial grand strategy. Mm-hmm. It's not coming from the left. This is coming
Foreign
from
Affairs
the
magazine,
right.
the bastion of mainstream opinion.
They say, we don't want this new Imperial grand strategy. And all the way through, it's been pretty harshly criticized.
Then the question at the end of the Bush years is, what is the impact of the Bush years on the American imperial project? Because public opinion globally about the United States is at an all-time low. Other powers are rising, becoming more confident, asserting themselves in the space that American retreat, at least in terms of popularity, is providing. So are we seeing the slow death of an empire beginning, or is this just a chapter?
Well, it's interesting. There was an interesting article by a friend of mine, a very good left historian, back in before the 2000 election, saying he hoped that Bush would win. I thought he was out of his mind. But his argument was exactly what you're saying. Is if Bush wins, these guys are so extreme, they're going to undermine the imperial project.
Wait a second, I didn't say that was a good thing.
No, but he wanted, I understand.
That's a harsh political position to hope for bad.
Well, to hope for the collapse of the imperial project. From
You're going to need another hour to discuss that.
Okay. But I don't think that's going to happen. The country's just too rich, too powerful. I suspect a shift towards what's called moderation, something like the Clinton position. For example, if you take a look at Clinton, the Clinton Doctrine, taken literally, was more extreme than the Bush Doctrine.
Of humanitarian intervention, you mean, so-called?
That's not what the Clinton Doctrine was. They were quiet. They weren't like Bush. They didn't sort of wave it in your face and enrage people. But when the Secretary of Defense testified to Congress, he explained that the United States has the right to use force to ensure access to markets and resources without even the pretext that Bush called for. That's more extreme than Bush, and very frank.
It's maybe more honest.
That's honest and frank and never reported because it was quiet.
You don't see the blatantness of the Bush years as significantly setting back.
They set it back, but I think it'll be recovered because of the distribution of power in the world. With all of the American economy has serious problems. Go back from the Reagan years. It's based on sort of spend and borrow as if there's no tomorrow. And sure, that has costs. But this is an enormously wealthy country with tremendous advantages. No other country comes close.
Isn't the American advantage today more and more military than economic? Because there are clearly other economic powers rising to compete with
On the other
America.
hand, we shouldn't exaggerate that either. So, for example, it takes a manufacturing production. I mean, it's commonly pointed out correctly that manufacturing production in the United States has declined. But if you look at the share of manufacturing production by US-based corporations, that's pretty steady. And they don't care whether it depends what you think the country is. If you think the country is the thing that's colored green on the map, okay, it's declining. If the country is the people who own the country, well, they're doing just fine. And in fact, even in things like manufacturing production, they can just exploit people better and so on in China or Indonesia than they can here.
We are preciously short on time, so let me ask you one last quick question, which is a big one, and I apologize. What is the state of resistance in America today? Because people outside America look and say the vast majority of people disagree with government policy on war, on healthcare, and electoral reform, and all kinds of other things. And we are all now on lots of email lists, exchanging information, drinking at the fountain of alternative media sources and better global broadcasting. But what's the state of resistance of the kind of social movement change that actually has changed things in this country and around the world in the past?
Well, I think it's higher than it's been in the past, but that's because of the successes in the past. So there are things we just take for granted now that you used to have to fight about, like, say, women's rights, or minority rights, or environmental issues, and so on. I mean, these were battlegrounds. I mean, they still are, but not to the extent that they were, because a lot has just been taken for granted. Take, say, the solidarity movements, third world solidarity movements. They never existed until the 1980s. I mean, nobody in France thought to go live in an Algerian village to protect the people. Nobody went to go live in a Vietnamese village to offer some help or protection of a white face. I mean, in the 1980s, thousands of people from the United States did that, right from the mainstream, incidentally, like churches in Kansas and stuff. And now it's all over the world. There's, peacemakers all over the place. These are new things. So if you count the number of people involved, it's very large, probably larger than ever. On the other hand, it's atomized. So people in one corner of town don't know what's going on in the other corner. Actually, I see that myself. I've been active in this area for all my life, 50 years. Of course, from the point of view of centralized power, that's okay. That's what they want, an atomized, separated population. And as long as that's the case, the intellectual classes can maintain the doctrinal system, and centralized power can do pretty much what it wants, even if the population knows that it's all cynical fraud. But that can be overcome. It's happened in the past, happens elsewhere, it can happen here too.
A very hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.